With the NBA draft coming up, it's only right that we talk about the draft, and more specifically about how unpredictable that night can really be. At times, not even the fans have any clue what's going on, which is why today we're looking at 10 NBA legends that have been booed on draft night. Some fans think they know it all, but here's why that's anything but the truth. I mean, look at Steve Nash. He would go on to become a two-time league MVP, an all-time great point guard, and one of the greatest passers the game's ever seen. But even back when he was drafted, Suns fans booed him. You see, and everything that led to that moment started all the way back when he was a kid. Because when Steve was 12 years old, he told his parents that he was going to be a star in the NBA one day. Well, apparently they didn't listen, because when Steve's grades started to drop, his parents moved him to a small private school that was unknown to scouts in the basketball world. So even though he averaged 21, 11, and 9 as a senior, he wasn't recruited by any major colleges. He actually sent tapes to every major school, but everyone passed on him, until Santa Clara eventually picked him up. And Nash spent all 4 years playing there, developing into a really solid basketball player, even making some noise in the NCAA tournament. But apparently it wasn't enough, because during the draft, Steve went under the radar and fell to the 15th pick, and would have fallen even further too had it not been for a Suns assistant coach that was friends with Santa Clara's coach. So he was picked 15th, and even Suns fans booed him because they were getting a relatively unknown player. They weren't happy about it, and they let it be known. And Steve Nash was apparently so caught up in the moment of getting picked up by an NBA team that he didn't even know they booed him until afterwards, saying, "It's unfortunate, but I think people will realize I'll work as hard as I can and I will succeed." And he was right too. Even though it took him years to find a starting role in the league, after a while he did, and the rest was history. And eventually, in every single game he played, he made Phoenix Suns fans regret booing him at the start of his career. But for as bad as that was, let's not all forget that even Stephen Curry was booed on draft night. But okay, this one actually isn't a bad thing. As we know, Steph was drafted 7th overall by the Warriors, and the only reason you can hear boos right after David Stern called his name was because those were by New York Knicks fans who had the 8th overall pick and desperately wanted Curry. You see, so even though Knicks fans booed here, they knew exactly what they were talking about, seeing the way Curry's career's gone. And trust me, I'd be mad too if I had to draft Jordan Hill instead. But hang on, let's not give Knicks fans too much credit here, because once Kristaps Porzingis was drafted back in 2015, these are the same fans that gave out the loudest boo I've ever heard during an NBA draft. A little kid even started crying in the crowd. Carmelo Anthony was reportedly furious at the pick, and the situation couldn't have been worse. But why is that? Well, there was a few reasons. Kristaps was coming off of playing overseas, averaging just 10 points and 4 rebounds a game. And seeing that Carmelo Anthony was 30 years old at the time, they didn't have the time to wait 2 to 3 years for his game to develop. The Knicks wanted to win now, and they didn't think Kristaps was the guy to help them do that. Plus, at the time, there was a stat going around that there had been 19 international players drafted since 2002, and not a single one of them had become an all-star. Well, as we know, every Knicks fan in attendance that night was wrong on this one, seeing that the Knicks almost doubled their wins after Kristaps was selected, and in just 3 short years, he was already a first-time all-star for putting up 22 points a game. Yeah, sure, he didn't last long on the team, and his career's been up and down since, but those fans didn't know any of that at the time. Plus, the fact that they originally wanted their team to draft either Emmanuel Mudiay or Justice Winslow instead makes them look that much worse. But this wasn't the first time fans booed a top international draft pick and had it backfire, because even Yao Ming heard huge boos after his name was called 1st overall back in 2002. You see, fans and even the media at the time just couldn't wrap their heads around a player from China being deserving of going first, even if he was 7'6", with Charles Barkley being the most notable to speak out and saying Yao would fail in the NBA. Not even his 39 points, 20 rebounds a game, and 76% from the field in China made him think otherwise. But as we know, this year both fans and media were wrong, because Yao Ming's career really turned out to be a success, with him being one of the best big men in the league when healthy. And sure, injuries ended up ruining his career, but everyone in the crowd that night wasn't booing because they felt like Yao was an injury risk. They were booing because they didn't think he had the skill to make it in the league, and he actually did. Now, one that might actually surprise you, and that some people forget about, is Jaylen Brown, and how Celtics fans really weren't a fan of him when he was taken 3rd overall. And this one was bad. Jaylen was coming off of his freshman season of college, which was an okay year. So based on that, Boston fans booed, to the point where the team owner came out to address the fans, and they all started booing him too. Well, later that night, the owner even said he walked up to another Celtics fan in the building and made a comment about Jaylen being a future MVP, and the fan couldn't have been any more disappointed that he felt that way. So those fans really didn't see anything at all in Jaylen, and wanted their team to draft a guy like Jamal Murray or Buddy Hield, who showed that they had a lot more skill at the time. But while I can definitely see where they're coming from, they should have known it was the Celtics they were talking about, and that team just doesn't make bad moves. And they clearly didn't, as he's one of the best players in the game today, just not in Game 7s apparently. Now, on the other hand, another fan base that should know better than to boo their own team on draft night is the San Antonio Spurs. You see, because back in 2011, the Spurs lost to the Grizzlies in the first first round. And while fans thought Tony Parker's time was up in San Antonio, Greg Popovich had something else in mind. He knew Tony wasn't going anywhere and that his team needed more size and youth in their lineup. So he traded fan favorite point guard George Hill to the Pacers for the 15th overall pick. So when the Spurs used that 15th pick to draft Kawhi Leonard, the fans were already going to be ready to boo whoever was drafted. So they were all upset that they just traded their fan favorite point guard and thought they were now going to be left without one. But we're talking about the same team that drafted David Robinson, Tim Duncan, Manu, and Tony Parker. This team knew what they were doing. So when Tony went on to have a stellar last few years in the league, and Kawhi Leonard developed into a superstar, a future Hall of Famer, and won Finals MVP in just his third ever season, it didn't take very long at all for their fans to regret ever booing that night. But speaking of Hall of Famers, John Stockton was another NBA legend who was booed when he was drafted 16th overall. And you see, this one makes a little more sense. John was taken on the 1984 NBA draft. And as a Jazz fan, when you're sitting there watching Hakeem Olajuwon, Michael Jordan, and Charles Barkley get drafted earlier in the night, it can be hard to watch your team draft a relatively unknown 6'1" white guy who was thought to be too small to play point guard in the league. I get that, but little did they know what they had their hands on. Sure, it took John 4 seasons to get the starting point guard spot, but from there, the rest is history. And 14-point, 14-assist seasons followed year after year. Of course, it would have been hard to predict that Carmelo and Stockton would become one of the NBA's all-time greatest duos, and that John would be the league's all-time assist and steals leader for the next 40+ years. But he proved every single Utah Jazz fan wrong that night, eventually earned their respect, beat all odds, and the rest is history. The Orlando Magic also beat all odds back in the early 90s, because even though they managed to get the first overall pick and draft Shaq in 1992, they somehow managed to get the first pick in 1993 also, and with it, it was widely predicted that they would use it to draft Chris Webber, who was the leader of Michigan's Fab Five. Everyone thought it was a no-brainer and that that's what they were gonna do, but Shaq had been spending the entire offseason filming a movie with Penny Hardaway, and it was at that time that he realized he needed to play with him. So Shaq put in a lot of work to convince the team to give Penny a training session. Well, during that session, Magic G and Pat Williams quickly became convinced that Hardaway was going to be the next Magic Johnson or Oscar Robertson. So we fast forward to the draft, and Chris Webber's name was called as the first pick, so everyone cheered. But then they announced the trade of Chris Webber for Penny Hardaway, and every Magic fan booed, making the moment that these two men swapped hats on stage one of the draft's most iconic moments. Of course, down the line, Hardaway's career and potential was ruined with injuries, but it didn't even matter because Shaq was gone by that time anyways. As for the Indiana Pacers, well, their all-time greatest player has got to be Reggie Miller, but even he was booed by his own fans the night he was drafted. And it all came down to the fact that Pacers fans were expecting the team to draft hometown hero Steve Alford 11th overall in 1987, but instead Reggie was picked and boos filled the arena. Well, from that point on, Miller became a Hall of Famer and Steve lasted 4 seasons in the league. So yeah, the team made the right move, and it wasn't even up for debate because at the time the Pacers were really excited for the pick they had and had all the confidence in the world that Reggie Miller was the right guy to go with. And even when all the fans booed, they still knew they had picked a guy who had confidence, shooting ability, and all the aggression a future star needed. And pretty surprisingly, they were right. Now, we started the video off with a few international players, so it's only right we end it with one. And when Dirk Nowitzki got drafted, he actually got booed 2 separate times on draft night. Now, as we've seen throughout the video, international players usually get no love on draft night, and nothing's changed here. When Dirk was drafted 9th overall by the Bucks fans booed him. Then when the Bucks traded him and Patrick Garrity to the Mavs for Robert Traylor, Mavs fans booed Dirk. So he was getting booed by both teams no matter where he went. And it was tough because then he had a pretty bad rookie season, which only justified their reactions that he got that night. But his rookie year was the end of that because from there the rest was history and Dirk became a superstar. Not even to mention they were able to trade Patrick Garrity down the line for Steve Nash, giving them both of these guys for just Robert Traylor. So Mavs fans couldn't have been any more wrong because they booed the decision that got them 2 eventual league MVPs on one team together. Sure, teams make a lot of bad picks, so booing seems justified, but if we've learned anything from this video, it's that sometimes you gotta just trust the process.